I'm going to talk about realist theory and why I think realist theory is the best available theory for explaining how the world works. Uh, and let me just start by talking about theory and what theory is. When I was young and I would go to Washington and I tell people that I was interested in IR theory, they would say, theory is nice, but that's what you academics do. And what we do here in the real world is policy. We do policy, and policy and theory are two different worlds. And I would always say, I think you're fundamentally wrong. I think that there's no way that you can do policy without theory. This is my saying that I often use with students. Theory is God. And you want to understand that. And you cannot be a policymaker without theory. And I'll just tell you a quick story in that regard, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what theory is. I once won a book award at Georgetown University. It was for the Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And at the dinner, I sat next to Madeleine Albright, who was at that point the former Secretary of State. And she leaned over to me at one point in the evening and she said, congratulations. And I think the kind of theoretical work that you do is interesting, but it's largely irrelevant in my world. And I said to her, I find it hard to believe that you would say that, because I said that you're one of the principal people I have on my syllabus from the policy world who shows evidence that theory permeates the thinking of policymakers. And I said there are three big liberal theories: economic interdependence theory, democratic peace theory, and liberal institutionalism. And I said, if you look carefully at all your writings, those theories are front and center in terms of how you think about the world. And I said, you are a fundamentally theoretical being. You just refuse to accept that. And you can kind of see the smoke coming out of her ears. She wasn't sure of what to make about that, but it was true. Theory is of enormous importance for policymakers, and I'll talk more about that as we go along. But first, let me just say a few words about what I think theory is. The key point you want to understand is we live in an incredibly complicated world, and trying to make sense of the world that we live in is remarkably difficult. And the only way that you can make sense of the world is with theories. Theories are simplifications of reality. Sometimes students will say to me, I want to come up with a simple theory, to which I reply, all theories are simple, so you don't need that adjective, simple. Theories are simplifications of reality. Basically, you recognize the fact that there are lots of factors that are at play in influencing events. But what you're doing is you're taking a number of those factors and throwing them on the cutting room floor, and you're relying on one or two factors to underpin how you think about the world. You're simplifying, right? What this tells you is that theories are sometimes going to be wrong, even realist theories. There is no theory that is right all the time, because sometimes those factors that you leave on the cutting room floor jump up and bite you in the hiney. To give you an example of this, Steve Walt and I, who are both card-carrying realists, wrote this book called The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. And lots of people over the years have delighted in pointing out in a gotcha moment that the Israel Lobby book contradicts our realist theory, because the Israel Lobby book says that domestic politics causes the United States to act in non-strategic ways. This is what the Lobby book says. It says the United States, when it comes to Israel, is not behaving the way a realist would expect American policymakers to behave. It's because of the lobby, domestic politics. And people expect us, when they level that charge us to be defensive and say, oh, no, the lobby book really fits in with their theory. But our response is, you're absolutely correct. The Israel lobby book contradicts my basic theory of international politics. And the same thing is true with Steve. And that's because domestic politics is on the cutting room floor in my theory. You all understand that. Domestic politics does not matter in John's theory. Am I saying domestic politics never matters in the real world? No, I'd be crazy to say that. I'm just saying it doesn't matter that much. And in most cases, when it does matter, it doesn't matter very much. For me, what matters are a handful of structural factors. And those structural factors can tell you a lot about how the world works, but they can't tell you everything. So it's just very important to understand that you, all of you, need theories to make sense of the world. Whether you're talking about raising children and the theories that you have in your head for how you discipline your children when they misbehave, or whether you're talking about running Greek foreign policy or American foreign policy, you can't make decisions in terms of how to think about the world without a theory in your head. Just to give you one example of this, when China was rising in the 1990s and into the 2000s, I said that the United States should not facilitate China's rise. This is a huge mistake. You're going to create a peer competitor. You want to keep China as weak as possible. This is realism 101. But the United States of America was dominated by liberals. The foreign policy establishment was, and they had a series of liberal theories that they employed for thinking about China. Their idea was that if you get China hooked on capitalism and you integrate them into the global economy and you facilitate economic interdependence, we'll have no problem at all. Furthermore, if you integrate them into international institutions, they will become, in Robert Zoellick's famous terminology, responsible stakeholders. And once they become responsible stakeholders, and once they're hooked on capitalism, as happened with the Asian tigers, will happen with China. It will become a liberal democracy. And once it's a liberal democracy, it will be no problem for Japan or the United States because they're liberal democracies. And as you all know, liberal democracies never fight each other in the liberal story. That's their story. So it's very important to understand that the policy of engagement toward China was based on the three principal liberal theories. And the critics of liberal hegemony, and there were not many of them, were people like me, who were realists, who said that whether China is a democracy or not doesn't matter. If it becomes powerful, it's going to have a big appetite. And in my mind, it's going to want to dominate East Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. They'd be nuts not to want to dominate East Asia. They want to be really powerful. They remember what happened the last time they were weak. It's called the century of national humiliation, right? So from a realist point of view, I was opposed. And by the way, just to go to NATO expansion, the realists, George Kennan being the most famous example, argued that NATO expansion was a ridiculous and foolish move, and it was going to end up causing a huge crisis with the Soviet Union / Russia, and we should not expand NATO. But there's a whole set of liberal theories, I'm not going to go into this now, that underpinned our expansion of NATO eastward. They who were in charge, this is the Clinton administration to start, then the Bush administration, the Obama administration, they believed that NATO expansion was not going to lead to disaster because they had these liberal theories. Realists disagreed. The only point I'm trying to make to you here is that you want to understand that there is no way you can formulate foreign policy. There's no way you can think intelligently about foreign policy without a theory in your head. But as my discussion points out, and you surely have all figured this out, what you see is there are competing theories in international politics. And of course, what he wanted me to do is talk about the virtues of realism, which I'll do in a minute. But you all understand that realism is a hard sell. It was especially a hard sell during the unipolar moment. Convincing people that NATO expansion was bad, that was difficult. Convincing people that engagement with China, that helping China to get rich made no sense. This is an argument that was almost impossible to make. And I'll say more about this as I go along. But we live in a world where theory is God. And when you go to Washington or you come to a place like Athens and you talk to policymakers and they diss theory, they, in fact, in practice, use theories to think about the world. You have no choice, and you have no choice because the world is so complicated that you can't make sense of it and you can't make decisions unless you have theories in your head.